just brought the whole horrific image back to my mind, and I felt that I was seeing reality really.
Very often I hear him telling, it's okay, it was much, much worse in Cambodia.
It's a seminal film which has survived for many, many years.
Art, it's been widely said, imitates life. But there are also moments when it changes it. The impact of the killing fields was so profound that some credit it with helping launch Cambodia's peace plan, ending decades of civil war. Welcome to episode 13 of Who Killed Haingngor? This is my real-time and crowdsourced podcast in which we explore lingering questions about the murder and the legacy of Dr. Haing S. Ngor. He was the actor who starred as Dith Pran in the killing fields, who went on to become a humanitarian and a businessman. This is the second episode of a two-parter in which I'm talking with journalist Jon Swain and photographer Roland Neveu. Along with Ngor, they share the distinction of having been the only people on the set of the killing fields who were also in Phnom Penh in 1975. In the last episode, we looked at Dith Pran, who is of course the New York Times assistant reporter. In this episode, we look at Haing Ngor as the film was being made. It was 1984 and the killing fields was being shot in Thailand. As someone who witnessed the immense tragedy that was the fall of Phnom Penh, Jon Swain had doubts that Hollywood could do it justice. He was dispatched to the set by his newspaper, the Sunday Times.
Any misgivings I had were taken away straight away because I was taken to a scene they were shooting in a old-fashioned historical building in Bangkok, which was being used as the Praeket Malaya Hospital in Phnom Penh. And it was a horrific scene at the time in 1975 in the fall of Phnom Penh. The hospital was full of wounded people, overflowing with wounded people, and the hospital staff had mostly left because of the dangers of rockets falling on Phnom Penh at that time. And they were frightened of the arrival of the Khmer Rouge. So it was brimming over with wounded civilians and soldiers. And the scene I saw in real life was a corridor full of wounded and dying people with so much blood on the floor that it was actually being washed down the lift shaft by someone sweeping the corridor with a broom. And they recreated this scene very, very vividly in the film.
The scene was accurate to the point of flashback.
The first thing I saw was this corridor full of Thai extras lying motionless in the corridor, covered in Kensington gore, make-believe blood, not moving for hours and hours, and all of that. And it just brought the whole horrific image back to my mind, and I felt that I was seeing reality really.
Jon Swain, as I said, was the correspondent for the British newspaper, the Sunday Times. He's played by Julian Sands in the film. Photographer Al Rockoff is played by John Malkovich. Sidney Schanberg, the New York Times correspondent, is played by Sam Waterston, and Dith Pran, as we know, was played by Haing Ngor. The first time Jon met Ngor was on the film set. He was immediately impressed by his commitment.
He had a calmness and a depth to him, which was interesting. And it's only later on, as I got to know him, that I learned bits and pieces of his background. He didn't talk about it, but thinking about it now, or thinking about it even at the time, I mean, he was clearly still traumatized by the horrors he'd been through, and yet he was desperate because he was so devoted to playing the role of Pran. It was real life for him, as if he was playing what really, in a sense, and with the emotion and everything of what had happened to him.
Roland Neveu, whom we also heard from last episode, is a photojournalist. His war zone work spans from Cambodia to Afghanistan, Lebanon, El Salvador, the Philippines, Uganda, and Iraq, among other spots. Roland has also worked extensively on film sets. IMDb lists 36 movies. Many of them are Indochina classics like Platoon, Heaven and Earth, Good Morning Vietnam, Born on the 4th of July, and City of Ghosts. That started as a lucky twist of fate. Columbia Pictures was the distributor of the killing fields in the U.S. Roland was based in Bangkok, Thailand, when Columbia found itself in need of an on-set photographer. So he got the call. Roland has sent me some fantastic photos from the set and some other moments mentioned in this episode that you'll definitely want to look at on the webpage. And as soon as he got on the set, Roland became very popular. And that's when you met Haingngor.
And this is why, I met Hang, because basically when I got on the film, I was the only one who had been in Phnom Penh at the time and who had witnessed the story. So in fact, I became a little more sought after by the actors and by the crew. So you were there, tell us, that kind of situation. Of course, Hank was, being an American Asian, he was, I would say, more shy, than the other actors, like Julian San. I really developed a very good relation with Julian. We were always talking because Julian wanted to know what's happened, and he was playing Jon Swain, which I knew a little also. So that was very interesting line of chit-chat, on the set. And slowly, we start to talk, and he started telling me his story as well.
Reading A Cambodian Odyssey, Haingngor's memoir, the treatment of Ngor by filmmakers struck me as somewhat manipulative. Obviously, I know I'm looking at this through the hindsight of a 2023 lens. Still, Ngor was famously plucked from the Long Beach refugee community and cast in the film. He was then told by director Roland Neveu to draw upon his personal tragedies to play Dith Pran. But Ngor had never aspired to acting. He had never studied it. And in 1983, a man who'd survived massive traumas, including repeated torture and witnessing the deaths of both his wife and father, and who'd never had any counseling, was told to dive into method acting. I don't think there was any malicious intent by the filmmakers in 1983, but my hunch is that 40 years of evolution later, there'd be greater sensitivity to trauma now. All that said, when it came to method acting, Ngor not only rolled with it, he excelled at it. Roland says all my concerns are misplaced. He's been on a lot of sets, and what matters the most is that the actor and director work in consensus, which is something Ngor and Neveu certainly did.
Oh, he was eager to do the most he could do. When you are not in a movie business and you know that you redo a scene like 10 times, 15 times, because the director asks you. So Hank never questioned that. He was so totally eager to get the performance out of himself to tell the story. He was driven, in fact, to tell the story on the movie. And you can feel it. He was 150%, really, all the time. That was interesting.
Method acting, it turns out, was something Ngor could keep in perspective.
Yeah, very often I hear him tell him, it's okay. It was much, much worse in Cambodia. So he said it never came to the level of difficulty that he experienced in the real life. No.
Ngor wasn't the only one who was dedicated.
It was so heartening as someone who'd lived through that experience to see film crew, and obviously the actors, but the film crew as well, be completely immersed in the Killing Fields story. They were reading up on it at night time, stuff on Cambodia, and they felt it was a really, really important subject that they were dealing with.
Remember in the last episode, I stole a clip of Dith Pran speaking from an ABC News primetime live broadcast? It's a report by Diane Sawyer. It was 1989, and ABC News took Dith Pran and Haingngor back to Cambodia. The Vietnamese military had occupied Cambodia since it forced the Khmer Rouge from power in 1979. 10 years later, it was withdrawing. Cambodia had become a quagmire for Vietnam. Roland happened to be in Phnom Penh at the same time. He was able to spend time with Ngor as he reconnected with his previous life, the one where he was a doctor, engaged to his fiancée, and whose family had some successful businesses like a lumber yard and a trucking company.
I think he was very happy to be able to retrace, his step, during the Khmer Rouge. And at the same time, probably rebuilt his Khmer-ness, his Cambodian-ness, understanding, trying to reassess himself. I walk with him around in Phnom Penh, so we walk around there taking pictures. People recognize him, so he would stop all the time, people talk to him, so that was kind of interesting as well.
Roland ran into Ngor yet again. It was on the set of Heaven and Earth. That was an Oliver Stone movie about Vietnam released in 1993, in which Ngor had a role. He had grown from the man he was a decade earlier, when The Killing Fields was made.
When I saw him back several times on Heaven and Earth and in Cambodia, he was confident. He gives the impression that he's in control of himself, and he's enjoying, or he projects that he's enjoying what he's doing,
For all its intensity, The Killing Fields, of course, has a happy ending. After being forced from the French embassy, Dith Pran spends years in forced labor camps pretending to have been a peasant in his previous life, or at least working class. He eventually escapes the Khmer Rouge, crossing the border into Thailand to a refugee camp. There, he reunites with Schanberg. Schanberg soon wrote The Death and Life of Dith Pran. It's a long-form article for the New York Times Sunday magazine. It's the story The Killing Fields is based on. Haing Ngor, as we know, didn't get his happy ending, or at least the one he got was cut tragically short. He was murdered on February 25, 1996, in the parking lot of his apartment building in Los Angeles. Police call it a botched robbery, although, as I've said in the past, I'm not convinced. Here's Jon's reaction to the news.
It was total disbelief. I thought, what a cruel irony that a Cambodian who had suffered so much imprisonment, lost his wife under the Khmer Rouge, suffered all those hardships and survived, got himself to America, and in the country, which was his salvation in a way, he should be murdered a few years later in America, where he'd settled. It was unbelievable. It was a complete cruelty, cruel irony for him. Yeah.
The Sunday Times sent Jon to Los Angeles to investigate the possibility of the Khmer Rouge having killed Ngor, something neither he nor I think holds any water. Check out my perspective in episodes 9 and 10 of this podcast called Finding Comrade Duch. Roland had a slightly different reaction to the murder.
I was absolutely surprised, in a way, but I live in LA, so I know LA can be a very treacherous place, and you hear, okay, the guy got killed near his house. Okay, we are in Los Angeles, so it's not something which is going to surprise you.
What's really amazing to Roland, Jon, and me is how well The Killing Fields has endured. The 1970s are further and further away, but the movie hasn't aged at all. It's still on point, it's still tight, and nearly 40 years later, it's still relevant.
Yes, I'm extremely pleasantly surprised because everyone still talks about the Killing Fields when they talk about Cambodia, in England even, or in France when it's the La Déchirure, and it's a seminal film which has survived for many, many years. And it's, a journalist friend of mine was the other day in England was who covers war in Ukraine at the moment, was asked what her favourite war films were, and one of them was The Killing Fields.
There's a thought that took root in the back of my mind in the early 1990s when I was based in Phnom Penh. The Paris Peace Agreement had been signed in 1991 to end Cambodia's civil war. It wasn't just Cambodia's armed groups that signed it. There were 4 of those. 19 different countries signed it, all pledging to support a UN-supervised peace deal. Think about it. Officials from 19 different countries got together at various stages to fix a country that at this point had little strategic significance. That includes the US, China, Vietnam, and the Soviet Union, none of whom were all that cozy at the time. This brings us to William Shawcross. He's the author of Sideshow, Kissinger, Nixon, and the Destruction of Cambodia. The book is another seminal work, and the title says it all. I remember sitting in the Foreign Correspondents Club in Phnom Penh, and William Shawcross gave a talk.
Okay.
And he credited The Killing Fields with actually helping launch the peace plan. That, the international community basically got off its derriere and was reminded of, Cambodia was this awful situation, and it was still a mess. So, granted, other things happened, like the Berlin Wall had fallen, like the world had shifted, but he really thought that the film pushed people to do all the nuts and bolts to get peace talks off the ground. Would you go that far?
Well, thinking about it, yes, I would share William's thoughts on that. I hadn't thought of it before, but I think he would be right, because it did have such an impact. It put Cambodia on the map internationally and spurred that sort of feeling that the international community must do something.
I don't know about you, but until that moment, I didn't know a movie could do that. After escaping Cambodia, Dith Pran settled in the United States, reuniting with his family. He became a photographer for the New York Times. He died of cancer in 2008 at the age of 65. Sidney Schanberg died in 2016. He was 82. Al Rockoff remains a photographer and lives in Florida. He still goes back to Cambodia from time to time. Roland Neveu remains a photographer and lives in Bangkok. Journalist Jon Swain lives in London. We'll wrap here. One last thing. A few weeks before Jon Swain and I spoke, actor Julian Sands, who portrayed Swain in the movie, was confirmed to have died while hiking in the mountains outside Los Angeles. He'd been missing for 5 months. I'll put a clip of Jon's thoughts on the webpage. Jon was someone I'd first sought out for an interview for this podcast's Journos trilogy, for his thoughts on how dangerous it was to work in Cambodia in the 1970s. We didn't connect in time for that, but I've put some other clips of his on the webpage in episode 12, It's Always the Fixer. Thank you for listening. My name is MP Noonan. This is episode 13, my Baker's Dozen, and I will be taking a break from producing Who Killed Haingngor as I go traveling. I guess I'll call what I've done so far Season 1. Look for more, probably in late September or early October. Remember, this is a crowdsourced podcast, an experiment in journalism. If you knew Haingngor personally and would like to contribute, even just an interesting anecdote, please get in touch. And if you know any details about his murder that you think are relevant, please get in touch. I'll still be paying attention even while I'm traveling. The best way to reach me is to email whokilledhaingnor@gmail.com. Hang is Haing and Ngor is Ngor. Thank you for listening, and see you in Season 2.